Okay, hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about the project management and continues the topic that we talked about last time. And here we are going to talk about the 5.3, which is the define scope. Okay, so in the 5.3, the process, the define scope. And define scope is the process of developing a detailed description of the project and product. Okay, so the key benefit of this process is that it describes the project, the service, or result boundaries by defining which of the requirements collected will be included in and excluded from the project scope. So the detailed project scope statement is critical to project success. Project scope statement is part of the scope management plan, and you can consider that it's a larger document that contains all the strategies, the rules, the procedures to manage your project scope. So in the same way, the scope management plan is an important component of your project plan. But there is something that is a little bit different, that is the what is and is not included in the project and its deliverables. And we will talk about the deliverables in the following slides. And before we get into it, I'll refresh the defined scope again. It is during the project planning, the project scope is defined and described with greater specificity, and as more information about the project is known. For example, the existing risks and assumptions and constraints are analyzed and added or updated as necessary. So they are the information in the project. So as we know that the planning is iterative, okay? It's a repeat process. So when scope defined at first time and go to plan all other knowledge areas like time, cost, quality, and risk, then the project manager will come back again to refine and enhance the final scope as per effects from other constraints. It's a repeat process that the project manager has to refine the details again. So in these iterative lifecycle projects, a high-level vision will be developed for the overall project, but the detailed scope is determined one iteration at a time. So the defined scope process can be highly iterative, meaning a high-level scope will be developed for the overall project to get it started. But the detailed scope is determined one iteration at a time. You can think of it's like a progressively elaborated process. So as work progress based on the latest project scope defined. And how do you consider the requirements? Is it a objective or not? So the requirements is like a desired need, okay, for something to be achieved. So the requirements include the technical details of the products and services or the project activities, whereas the scope includes general statements related to product, service, and project activities. And requirements are collections of the capabilities that the customer needs in the final deliverables. So let's get into the defined scope about the inputs, outputs, and the tools and techniques, ITTO. Okay, so the inputs include the project charter, project management plan, the project documents, and enterprise environmental factors, and the OPA, organizational process assets. Okay, and in the TT, the tools and techniques, it has the expert judgment, data analysis, decision making, interpersonal and team skills, and the product analysis. And in the outputs, there are the project scope statements and project documents updates. Highlighted some items that is rather important. So in the inputs, in terms of the project documents, the assumption log is the role of the assumption log is to identify the assumptions and constraints okay, the limits in the project, about the project, the product, and stakeholders, environment, and other factors that can influence the project and the product scope. And regarding the requirements document, it is the process of identifying the list of requirements that are to be incorporated into the project scope. And the risk register is that mainly contains the response strategies that may affect the project scope by reducing the project and the product scope. So it is meant to avoid or mitigate a risk that is to occur in a project. And in terms of the enterprise environmental factors, the factors usually are the influence that define scope process include. Usually that could be the organization's culture, okay, the cultural difference, and the infrastructure as well, and the personal and administration and marketplace conditions. So let's say if you are in different countries, you might pay attention to the local regulations and the laws of doing the project, okay? And in terms of the OPA, the organizational process assets, the factors that influence the defined scope process include the policies or procedures and templates for the project scope statement, and also the project files from the previous projects and lesson learned from the previous phases and projects. So when it comes to the OPA, you can consider is the assets that created in the previous projects. And mostly are the organized knowledge in a different way of presentation. For example, it could be the PowerPoint or the documents, the Word file, the Excel, the statistics, and the process, procedures that appear before. And in the tools and techniques, there are 5 different items. So the first one is the expert judgment. Okay, so the expert judgment is always a good choice. Okay, you always need to find an expert to give you examples or suggestions. Okay, so with regards to the technique of expert judgment, one has always to consult a group and individual who has exceptional knowledge in dealing with the similar projects. Okay, so you have to find someone that has or already experienced in a similar project or topic that you are going through, okay? And the second one is the data analysis. So the data analysis, the best example is that it can be used in this process is alternatives analysis. So these alternatives analysis help in evaluating the ways to meet the requirements and objectives that are identified in the project charter. You have to find different alternatives to do the analysis. And the third one is the decision making. So there are multiple criteria decision analysis, and a decision matrix is used to provide a systematic and analytical approach for establishing the necessities like the requirements, schedules, budget, and resources to clarify the project and the project scope further. Okay, so you can use the matrix to define and make decisions about your project. And then the next one is the interpersonal and team skills. So the process is mainly used in workshops and sessions happening with the key stakeholders who are always high on expectations. So the final goal, the ultimate goal of this process is to reach a cross-functional and shared understanding of the project deliverables. And the fifth one is the product analysis. Okay, so the product analysis is used to define the products and services related to a particular project. Okay, so this could be the process. This process could include asking questions about the product or services and generating the answers to describe the use, the characteristics, and the other relevant aspects of what's going on to be and what is going to be delivered. So there are a few examples that are related to the product analysis process. Okay, for example, the product breakdown, the requirements analysis, and the systems analysis, and systems engineering, the value analysis, and value engineering. So there are a lot of ways of doing the product analysis. The next one, we are going to talk about in the outputs. The first one is the project scope statements. Okay, so the project scope statement is the description of project scope and the major deliverables and assumptions and the constraints. So the project scope statement documents the entire scope, okay, the range of the whole project, including the project and the project scope. So it describes in detail the project's deliverables and the work required to create those deliverables. In the project scope statement, it also documents the project scope and the product scope and describes the project's deliverables and the work required to deliver them. So based on the level and the degree of detail the project scope statement defines, the work that will be performed. In the PSS, the project scope statements, you will have to be briefly define and what you have to do and perform in the project. And the work that is minimized can help determine how well the project management team can control the overall project scope. And then here are some detailed project scope statements. Okay, so in terms of the project scope description, the progressively elaborates the characteristics of the product, service, or result described in the project charter and requirements documents. And regarding to the acceptance criteria in the statement, the criteria is a set of conditions, okay, that is required to be met before the deliverables are accepted. Okay, so you have to make sure everything is fit the criteria and before its delivery. And the last one is the deliverable. Okay, so any unique and verifiable product, results, or capability to perform a service that is required to be produced to complete a process, phase, or project. And here are some other items in a detailed project scope statement. So you have the project exclusion. So generally, it identifies what is excluded from the project, okay, what's not necessary. And next one is the constraints, it's the limitation. So limiting factors that affect the execution of the project or process is the constraint, okay, or you can say the limitation. And the last one is the assumptions. It's a factor in planning process that is considered to be true, real, certain, or without proof or demonstration. And it also describes the potential impact of those factors if they prove to be false. So as you can see here, it is the detail of the project scope statement. So as you can see that usually in the project scope statement, PSS, you will have a table, like an organized one. And you can have the project ID, the date, the project name, and the objectives of your project, and the scope definition, and the requirements of the project, and the boundaries, and deliverables, acceptance criteria, and constraints and assumptions, the schedule milestones. So everything you have to list it in more details. So the project scope statement, it is generally, it describes the project deliverables and the work required to create those deliverables. So the project scope statement provides a common understanding of the project scope among all the project stakeholders and describes the project's major objectives. And it also enables the project team to perform more detailed planning and guiding the project team's work during execution, and provides the baseline for evaluating whether requests for changes or additional work are contained within or outside the project's boundaries. So here is the detail of the project scope statements. So you will have a very basic information, the ID, the date, and the project name. And you have to write down the other items in details. So for example, the objectives usually include the measurable success criteria of the project. Okay, so you have to list something that is measurable. And projects may have a wide variety of business, the cost, the schedule, the technical and quality objectives. And the project objectives can also include cost, schedule, and quality targets. Okay, so each project's objective has attributes such as cost, volumes, or a matrix, and absolute or relative values. Okay, so it's rather broad. And in terms of the product scope definition, you have to describe the characteristics of the product, service, or results that the product was undertaken to create. Okay, so these characteristics will generally have less detail in early phases and more detail in the later phases as they are progressively elaborated. So the scope definition might be added in the later period of the project. So while the form and substance of the characteristics will vary, the scope description should always provide sufficient detail to provide later project scope planning. Okay, so the enough detail are important to the project scope definition. Okay, so because usually the scope definition will be expanded in the later phase of the project. And the following, we have the project requirements. So the requirements describe the conditions or capabilities that must be met or possessed by the deliverables of the project to satisfy a contract or a standard or the specification or other for a formally imposed document. Okay, so analysis of all stakeholder needs, wants, and expectations are translated into prioritized requirements. Okay, so here are the other items in the project scope statement. You have the project boundaries. It is to identify what is included within the project. So it also states explicitly what is excluded from the project. Okay, so if a stakeholder might assume that a particular product, service, or result could be a component of the project. And the project deliverables usually include both the outputs and the outputs that comprise the product or service of the project, as well as the ancillary results, such as the project management reports and the documentations. And depending on the project scope statements, the deliverables may be described at the summary level or in great details. And regarding to the project acceptance criteria, okay, that are the needs that have to meet the criteria. Okay, so to define the process and the criteria for accepting complete the products. Okay. And the last one is the project constraints. So it lists and describes the specific project constraints and associated with the project scope that limit the team's options. Okay, for example, a predefined budget or any imposed dates that are issued by the customer. And moreover, we have the assumptions, the project assumptions. So the assumptions are listed and described as the specific project. The assumptions are associated with the project scope and the potential impact of those assumptions if they prove to be false. Okay. And in terms of the initial project organization, usually regarding the members of the project team as well as the stakeholders are identified. Okay, so the organization of the project is also documented. And we have the schedule milestones, the time of the project. So the customer, the project sponsor, performing organization can identify the milestones and can place impose dates on those scheduled milestones. Okay, so these dates can be addressed as schedule constraints. Okay, and then it's about the fund limitation. Money is always the key issue in the project. Okay, so it describes any limitation placed upon funding or the project, whether in total value or over specified time frames. And the last one is the approval requirements. We have the identifies approval requirements that can be applied items such as project objectives, deliverables, documents, and work. So a lot of people would like to compare or might get confused between the project charter and the project scope statements. Okay, let's talk about these two. Okay, so the project charter and project scope statement are created in the early phases of a project, and they are used throughout the project to make sure we are going in the right direction. And the importance of a project charter and the project scope statements cannot be underestimated. Some studies show that 39% of projects fail due to the lack of planning. Okay, so once you are doing a project, the planning is very critical to the project. So the charter and the scope statement are the two essential documents that can help you avoid being part of the statistic. Okay, so if you have reached both, you probably scratching your head and wondering what the difference is, and you have to think about, do I really need both of them? So regarding the project charter, okay, the project charter is where we document why a project is being undertaken. Okay, so what will it deliver and what are the benefits it will bring? Okay, so the intended audience is everyone involved with the project. And the project charter is also an essential project document. This is where you agree with the stakeholders and clients what you will be delivering. Okay, so we mentioned that 39% of the project fail due to an inability to meet the requirements. And this is often caused by a lack of project charter. In many cases, a project charter will require sign-off before the project can be started. So what do we include in a project charter? Okay, there are a lot of things in the project charter. So you should have, or you should include a description and reason for the project. Okay, so something very brief and that gets across what the project is and why we need to it. If someone joins the project, they should be able to get a good understanding of the project by reading the charter. Okay, so the charter is a large scope and the fundamental things that you have to be included in the project. And usually we might get confused because we include the project scope as part of the charter. Essentially, the charter contains an overview of the project scope, and the project scope statement breaks it down into more detail. Okay, so the scope should be clear and concise. So you can consider the project charter is a large goal of the project, and the project scope statement is the detail of different goals in the project. Okay, So there should be no ambiguity around what the outcome of the project will be. So to make it clear that there is something that you won't deliver, okay, you have to write it in the charter. If the project was for a new marketing website, the scope might state that we will deliver the homepage, the blog, the ad, and the product features page, okay? And so you might also state that the e-commerce part of the site is out of scope. So don't fall into the trap of unmet expectations or delivering the wrong thing. Make sure the charter states clearly why the project is being undertaken and what it will deliver. So there are other things to include in the charter. There are the project staff and stakeholders, the people, and the high-level requirements, okay, and the basic project milestones and the risks, especially high-level risk you have to consider, and also the money, the budget, and the criteria for success. As you can see that the project charter is an important document, and make sure everyone reads, understands, and agrees on it. And in terms of the project scope statement, okay, it's much more like a breakdown of the project charter. So a project scope statement takes the scope from the charter and expand on it. Okay, it is essential that this is done collaboratively with the project team. So as a result, you are much more likely to get buy-in from your whole team. So that is essential if you want your project to be a success. While the audience for this is mainly the team that is useful when reporting to the stakeholders. Okay, so in the scope statement, we can define the following, okay, among others. So what the project deliverables are, and if we are delivering a software project, we might also need to deliver a help manual and training materials, okay? So we can think that in the scope statements, there are a lot more details about the charter and what constraints are in place, and does the team lack a certain skill, is a key project member not available all the time, and you have to think of what assumptions are we making about and how well things will go. And are we assuming that we have access to a certain piece of equipment that we need? Okay. Moreover, you have to think of what are the risks for the project. Is there a project member with highly specialized skill? And what happens if they leave? Okay, usually a company have around 10 to 20 turnover annually. And do we rely on another team delivering their project first? Okay, so the independency is also very important to the project team. Also, you have to think of what is out of scope. Okay, is there anything we need to make clear that we won't deliver? Okay, make sure that you cut clean with the unnecessary items. So is there any non-goals that need to be stated? Okay. So there are a lot of details that have to be considered and listed and written down in the scope statements. Okay. So the important thing to note about this document is that it is a living document. Okay. You can alter it, and therefore it should be updated and reviewed as a new information. As a result, it's only finished when the project is. Okay. So you can consider the scope statement is rather dynamic to the project because it has to continuously fulfill what are the risk, constraints, and risk of the project. So a lot of people will ask that, do we really need the project charter and the project scope statement at the same time? As you can see that there is some overlap in the content and the audience for these documents. So if you think and you feel that it's overkill for your project to maintain both, go ahead and merge them into one, okay? Both of them can be combined together, okay? And there are no hard and fast rules about this. Okay, there's no tricks about it. Just merge them and by in your own time pace. And it mostly depends on the type of the projects you're doing and who they are for. So if your projects are mainly internal to your company, you might not need to write down the separation. But the main thing it is to you is that to cover the details that are important to your project and to your team. Okay. So the most important thing is that to cover the detail and the important items about your project. So this is the overall of the defined scope. Okay.